The morning flight from Dallas to Washington, D.C. was packed with the usual mix of business travelers, families, and tourists. Flight 447 was a routine domestic journey that nobody expected would become memorable. Among the passengers settling into their seats was an elderly man who looked to be in his 70s, wearing a simple white button-down shirt, khaki pants, and well-worn leather shoes. His hair was silver gray, neatly combed but showing signs of age, and his hands bore the weathered marks of someone who had lived a full life. He made his way slowly down the narrow aisle, checking seat numbers until he found his destination, Seat 12C, a middle seat in the economy section. The man moved carefully, his joints clearly stiff from years of wear, and he took a moment to catch his breath before attempting to lift his small carry-on bag into the overhead compartment. "Excuse me, sir, do you need help with that?" asked a flight attendant, noticing his struggle. "Thank you, dear, but I can manage," he replied with a gentle smile, his voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of decades of experience. As he settled into his seat, the passengers around him began to take notice. To his left sat a young man in an expensive suit, fingers flying across his smartphone screen as he conducted what seemed like important business calls. To his right was a middle-aged woman dressed in designer clothes, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her tablet as she scrolled through social media. The businessman glanced at the elderly passenger with barely concealed irritation. He was clearly annoyed that his spacious seating arrangement had been disrupted by what he perceived as a frail old man who would likely need constant assistance during the flight. "Great," the businessman muttered under his breath to his companion across the aisle. "Just what I needed for this important flight." The woman beside the elderly man seemed equally unimpressed. She looked at his simple clothing and weathered appearance with obvious disdain, as if his presence somehow diminished her own status. When the elderly man politely asked if he could squeeze past her to reach his seat, she huffed and made an exaggerated show of moving her belongings. "Some people really should consider their seating choices more carefully," she said loudly enough for others to hear, clearly directing her comment at the elderly passenger. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the comments became more pointed and cruel. A group of young travelers in the rows behind began making jokes about Grandpa needing a wheelchair and wondering if he would remember where he was going when the plane landed. Their laughter carried throughout the cabin, causing other passengers to turn and look. "I bet he still uses a flip phone," one of them snickered. "Probably doesn't even know what Wi-Fi is." The elderly man heard every word but said nothing. He simply opened a worn paperback book and began reading, occasionally glancing out the small window as the plane taxied toward the runway. His calm demeanor seemed to frustrate his tormentors even more, as if they had expected him to react or defend himself. During the meal service, the situation escalated further. When the flight attendant offered the elderly man a choice between chicken and pasta, he politely requested the chicken, but spoke so softly that she had to lean in closer to hear him. "Speak up, Grandpa," called out the businessman. "Some of us have important calls to make and can't wait all day for you to figure out what you want to eat." Several passengers laughed at this comment, and the elderly man's face flushed slightly with embarrassment. Still, he maintained his composure and simply nodded to the flight attendant, who shot disapproving looks at the other passengers. The woman beside him continued her commentary throughout the meal service. "I don't understand why airlines don't have separate sections for people who need extra assistance," she said in a voice clearly intended to be overheard. "It's really inconsiderate to other passengers who have places to be and things to do." What made the situation even worse was that other passengers began joining in the mockery. A couple in their 40s started making comments about how old people shouldn't travel alone, suggesting that the elderly man probably got confused easily and might wander off in the airport. A group of college students began placing bets on whether he would need help finding his connecting gate. The elderly man's only response was to continue reading his book, occasionally sipping water from a plastic cup. He moved slowly and deliberately, as if every action required careful thought and planning. When he needed to use the restroom, he stood up slowly and made his way down the aisle with careful steps, holding onto seat backs for support. "Look at him shuffle," whispered someone from the back. "He's probably holding up the bathroom line, too." Upon returning to his seat, the elderly man accidentally bumped into the businessman's elbow while trying to sit down. The younger man jerked his arm away dramatically and glared at him. "Watch where you're going, old man. You nearly made me drop my phone. That thing costs more than you probably make in a month." The woman beside him chimed in again. "Maybe he needs glasses. I swear, some people just don't know when they're too old to travel anymore." Throughout all of this harassment, the elderly passenger remained remarkably calm. He never raised his voice, never argued back, and never showed anger. The most he did was offer quiet apologies when his movements disturbed others, even when the disturbance was minimal or imaginary. About halfway through the flight, a group of military personnel in dress uniforms boarded during a brief layover. They were young officers, clearly proud of their service, and they moved through the cabin with the confidence that comes from military training. Most passengers barely noticed them, but the elderly man watched their progression with what seemed like professional interest. One of the military officers, a young captain, paused near row 12 and glanced at the elderly passenger. Something about the old man caught his attention, and he studied his face for a moment as if trying to place him. The captain's expression shifted from casual observation to what appeared to be recognition, then to surprise, and finally to something approaching reverence. The captain leaned over to whisper something to his colleague, who also turned to look at the elderly man. Both military officers now stared with obvious respect and amazement, but before either could approach, they were directed to continue moving toward their own seats by the flight crew. The businessman noticed this interaction and scoffed. "Great. Now even the military is checking on Grandpa. He's probably going to need an escort off the plane, too." The elderly man had noticed the military officer's attention, but seemed unsurprised by their recognition. He simply nodded politely in their direction and returned to his book, as if encounters like this were routine for him. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., the harassment from fellow passengers continued. The woman beside him complained loudly about how his slow movements had disrupted her work throughout the flight. The businessman made comments about hoping the elderly man had arranged for assistance at the airport because he was clearly going to need it. "I feel sorry for whoever has to pick him up," the woman said. "He's probably one of those old people who gets confused in crowds and wanders off." The college students behind them started a pool, betting on how long it would take the elderly man to collect his luggage and make it through the airport. They seemed to find great entertainment in imagining various scenarios where he would struggle with modern technology or get lost in the terminal. Even as the plane touched down and began taxiing to the gate, the comments continued. Passengers were already standing and gathering their belongings, but the elderly man remained seated, patiently waiting for the rush to subside. This prompted another round of commentary about how he was holding everyone up and didn't understand how airports work. The flight attendant who had helped him earlier approached with obvious concern. "Sir, would you like me to arrange for wheelchair assistance or someone to help you navigate the terminal?" Before the elderly man could respond, the businessman interjected loudly, "Yes, please get him some help. Some of us have connections to make and can't wait around all day." The elderly man politely declined the assistance, stating that he would be fine on his own. This prompted more laughter and eye-rolling from the passengers who had been tormenting him throughout the flight. "Sure you will, Grandpa," called out one of the college students. "Just try not to get lost in the terminal." As passengers began filing off the plane, the elderly man remained in his seat, still reading his book and seemingly unbothered by the chaos around him. The military officers who had noticed him earlier were now standing in the aisle, clearly waiting for something or someone, but the elderly passenger appeared not to notice their presence. The businessman grabbed his expensive carry-on bag and pushed past the elderly man's seat, deliberately bumping him with his luggage. "Move it along, old-timer. Some of us have important people waiting for us." The woman beside him gathered her designer bags and made one final comment. "I really hope they start screening passengers better. There should be age limits or competency tests for flying." As the last of the mocking passengers filed off the plane, the elderly man finally stood up slowly and reached for his modest carry-on bag. The flight crew watched him with mixture of sympathy and concern, clearly having witnessed the harassment he had endured throughout the flight. What none of the departing passengers knew, and what would soon become clear to everyone in the terminal, was that they had just spent 3 hours mocking a man whose identity and accomplishments would soon make their cruel comments seem not just inappropriate, but absurdly ignorant. The elderly man walked slowly down the aisle toward the exit, nodding politely to the flight crew members who had shown him kindness during the flight. Behind him, the military officers followed at a respectful distance, their faces showing a mixture of awe and anticipation. As he stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, the elderly passenger had no idea that his true identity was about to be revealed in a way that would shock everyone who had witnessed his humiliation. The calm dignity with which he had endured the harassment was about to be explained, and those who had mocked him were about to learn exactly who they had been dealing with. The terminal ahead buzzed with typical airport activity, but within minutes, that ordinary atmosphere would transform into something extraordinary, all because of the quiet old man in the white shirt and khaki pants who had been sitting in seat 12C. Colonel William Hawk Morrison walked through the jet bridge with the same measured pace he had maintained throughout the flight. At 73 years old, he carried himself with quiet dignity, despite the aches that reminded him daily of his age. The harassment from fellow passengers had been nothing new for him. In civilian clothes, without his uniform or rank insignia, he was just another elderly man to most people. What they didn't know was that they had been sitting next to one of the most decorated fighter pilots in American military history. As he entered the terminal, Colonel Morrison noticed the 2 young military officers from the flight standing nearby, clearly waiting for him. The captain approached first, his posture snapping to attention despite being in a civilian airport. "Excuse me, sir," the captain said respectfully. "Are you Colonel William Morrison, call sign Hawk?" The elderly man paused and looked at the young officer with tired but kind eyes. "I am, though I retired from active duty 15 years ago, son." "Sir, I'm Captain James Rodriguez, and this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen. We're both F-35 pilots stationed at Langley. We couldn't believe it when we recognized you on the flight." The captain's voice carried genuine awe and excitement. Colonel Morrison smiled gently. "Well, I appreciate your service, both of you. The F-35 is quite an aircraft. Much different from what I flew back in my day." What the young pilots knew, and what the mocking passengers would soon discover, was that they were talking to a living legend. Colonel Morrison's call sign, Hawk, had become synonymous with precision, courage, and innovation in military aviation circles. His career had spanned 42 years of service, during which he had not only flown combat missions, but had also been instrumental in developing tactics and training programs that were still used by pilots today. Born in 1951 in a small farming town in Kansas, William Morrison had always dreamed of flying. His father was a crop duster, and young William had spent countless hours watching planes take off and land at the local airstrip. When he turned 18, he enlisted in the Air Force with the single goal of becoming a pilot. What he couldn't have imagined was the extraordinary career that lay ahead of him. Morrison had earned his wings in 1973 during the height of the Cold War. His first assignment was flying F-4 Phantoms, but his exceptional skills quickly caught the attention of his superiors. He had an intuitive understanding of aerial combat that couldn't be taught in classrooms or simulations. Other pilots said he could read the sky like others read books, anticipating enemy movements and tactical situations with uncanny accuracy. In 1979, Morrison was selected for the elite Top Gun program at the Navy Fighter Weapons School. Even though he was an Air Force pilot, his reputation had crossed service boundaries. At Top Gun, he wasn't just a student. He quickly became an instructor, teaching naval aviators the advanced combat techniques that he had developed through years of experience and natural talent. But it was during Operation Desert Storm in 1991 that Colonel Morrison truly made his mark on aviation history. Flying an F-16 Fighting Falcon, he completed 37 combat missions over Iraq, more than any other pilot in his squadron. His precision in targeting enemy positions while avoiding civilian casualties became legendary among his peers. Military commanders began requesting him specifically for the most challenging and dangerous missions. During one particular mission, Morrison's aircraft was hit by enemy fire while conducting a bombing run on a heavily defended military installation. With his hydraulics damaged and his fuel running low, most pilots would have aborted the mission and returned to base. Instead, Morrison completed his attack, destroying the target with surgical precision, then managed to nurse his damaged aircraft back to friendly territory. He made an emergency landing at a forward airbase with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining. That mission earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross, but it was far from his only decoration. Over the course of his career, Colonel Morrison accumulated an impressive collection of medals and commendations: 2 Silver Stars, 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 3 Bronze Stars, and the Legion of Merit, among others. His military personnel file read like a catalog of exceptional service and heroism. In the late 1990s, Morrison was selected to participate in the development of the F-22 Raptor program. His combat experience and tactical expertise made him invaluable in testing the aircraft's capabilities and helping to design training protocols for future F-22 pilots. He was one of the first pilots to fly the revolutionary aircraft in combat simulations, pushing it to its limits and identifying areas for improvement. The young pilots speaking with him in the airport knew all of this history, which was why they could barely contain their excitement at meeting their hero in person. Captain Rodriguez continued the conversation. "Sir, we've studied your combat tactics in our training programs. The Morrison maneuver is still taught at flight school. Every F-35 pilot knows about your contributions to modern aerial combat." The Morrison maneuver was indeed named after the colonel. It was a complex aerial combat technique that he had developed during his time as an instructor, combining elements of traditional dogfighting with modern electronic warfare capabilities. The maneuver had saved countless lives in combat situations and was considered one of the most effective defensive tactics in modern aviation. Colonel Morrison had also been instrumental in developing joint training exercises between different branches of the military. His understanding of how different aircraft and pilots could work together in complex battle scenarios had revolutionized military aviation tactics. The integration protocols he helped design were still being used in current military operations around the world. In 2003, at the age of 52, Morrison had volunteered to return to combat duty during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Most colonels his age and rank were assigned to desk jobs or training positions, but Morrison felt a duty to serve alongside the younger pilots he had trained. Flying an F-16 equipped with the latest avionics and weapons systems, he completed another 43 combat missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. During his second tour in the Middle East, Morrison served not only as a combat pilot, but also as a mentor to younger aviators. His aircraft became known as Papa Bird among the squadron, and pilots would request to fly alongside him whenever possible. His calm voice over the radio during intense combat situations became a source of confidence and reassurance for pilots facing their first real combat experience. One particular incident during this tour had become legend among military aviators. A young pilot in Morrison's squadron had been shot down over enemy territory, and rescue operations were being planned for the following day due to heavy anti-aircraft fire in the area. Colonel Morrison couldn't accept leaving one of his kids behind overnight. Against direct orders from command, he took off alone in his F-16 and conducted a nighttime combat air patrol over the downed pilot's position. For 6 hours, Morrison flew in dangerous airspace, engaging enemy forces and keeping them away from the crashed pilot. When rescue helicopters finally arrived at dawn, they found the enemy had retreated from the area entirely. The downed pilot was rescued without further incident, and Morrison's aircraft landed with battle damage from the night-long engagement. The mission earned him his second Silver Star and the undying loyalty of every pilot in his squadron. After retiring from active duty in 2010, Colonel Morrison had not simply disappeared into civilian life. He had continued serving his country as a consultant and instructor for military contractor companies. His expertise was particularly valued in the development of training programs for the F-35 Lightning II, the military's newest multi-role fighter aircraft. The F-35 program represented the future of military aviation, and Morrison's experience with previous generations of fighter aircraft made him uniquely qualified to help bridge the gap between traditional flying techniques and the advanced capabilities of the new aircraft. Pilots training on the F-35 often spent weeks learning from Morrison, absorbing decades of combat experience and tactical knowledge. His consulting work had taken him all over the world, training not only American pilots, but also Allied forces who would be flying F-35s. British, Australian, Israeli, and Italian pilots had all benefited from Morrison's instruction. His ability to adapt complex aerial combat concepts for pilots from different military traditions had made him an invaluable asset to international defense cooperation efforts. What made Morrison particularly remarkable was his continued involvement in actual flight operations well into his 70s. While most military pilots were required to retire from flying duties by age 60, Morrison's exceptional physical condition and unmatched experience had earned him special authorization to continue flying in training and consulting roles. He underwent rigorous medical examinations every 6 months to maintain his flight status, and he consistently passed with results that amazed doctors half his age. The reason for his current trip to Washington, D.C. was a perfect example of his ongoing service. Morrison had been invited to testify before a congressional committee about military aviation training programs. His recommendations would influence defense spending decisions affecting thousands of current and future pilots. Despite his age and the discomfort of commercial travel, he had insisted on making the trip because he believed strongly in his duty to support the next generation of military aviators. Standing in the airport terminal with the 2 young F-35 pilots, Morrison represented a living link between the early days of military aviation and its high-tech future. The aircraft he had flown during his early career seemed primitive compared to modern fighters, but the basic principles of courage, skill, and dedication that he embodied were timeless. Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Chen continued their conversation with their hero, unaware that their presence in the terminal was about to create a situation that would vindicate the quiet dignity Morrison had shown during his harassment on the airplane. "Sir," Lieutenant Chen said, "we're actually part of a training squadron that uses your tactical manuals. Every pilot in our unit knows who you are and what you've accomplished. It's an honor to meet you in person." Morrison smiled at the young lieutenant. "The honor is mine, Lieutenant. You and pilots like you are the reason I keep doing this work. The aircraft may change, but the courage and skill of American pilots remains constant." As they spoke, other passengers from Flight 447 began walking past them in the terminal. The businessman who had been so cruel during the flight hurried by, talking loudly into his phone about an important meeting. The woman who had complained about Morrison's presence struggled with her multiple designer bags. The college students who had made jokes about the old man laughed loudly as they headed toward their connecting gate. None of them paid any attention to the elderly passenger they had tormented, who was now engaged in respectful conversation with two military officers. They had no idea that they were walking past a man whose contributions to their country's defense were immeasurable, whose courage in combat had saved countless lives, and whose ongoing service continued to protect their freedom. The irony was about to become much more pronounced, because what was about to happen next would not only reveal Morrison's true identity to everyone in the terminal, but would also demonstrate the level of respect and admiration he commanded from the very people who represented the pinnacle of modern military aviation excellence. As Colonel Morrison continued his conversation with Captain Rodriguez and Lieutenant Chen, the normal bustle of the airport terminal was suddenly interrupted by an announcement over the public address system. Attention passengers and visitors. We have been informed that Colonel William Morrison, distinguished Air Force veteran and recipient of multiple combat decorations, is currently in our terminal. We would like to acknowledge his service and sacrifice for our country. The announcement caused heads to turn throughout the terminal, but most people simply glanced around briefly before returning to their own business. The passengers from Flight 447, who had spent the journey mocking the elderly man, paid no attention to the announcement, assuming it referred to someone else entirely. Captain Rodriguez looked at Colonel Morrison with surprise. "Sir, did you know they were going to make that announcement?" Morrison shook his head with a slight smile. "I had no idea. Someone must have called ahead. I hope it doesn't cause too much of a fuss." What happened next would prove that his hope was in vain, but in the most spectacular way possible. Lieutenant Chen's phone began buzzing with incoming messages. She glanced at the screen and her eyes widened. "Captain, you need to see this. It's from our squadron commander." Captain Rodriguez read the message over her shoulder, and his expression transformed from curiosity to amazement to something approaching disbelief. "Sir," Rodriguez said, his voice barely containing his excitement, "our entire squadron is airborne right now, conducting training exercises about 50 miles from here. When our commander heard that you were in this area, he's arranged something special." Before Morrison could ask what was planned, the terminal's public address system crackled to life again, this time with a different voice, the unmistakable crisp tone of air traffic control. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Washington Approach Control. We have been contacted by the United States Air Force regarding a special tribute. In approximately 3 minutes, a formation of F-35 Lightning II aircraft will be conducting a ceremonial flyover to honor Colonel William Morrison. Call sign Hawk. Please direct your attention to the windows facing south." This announcement had a dramatically different effect from the first one. Throughout the terminal, people began moving toward the large windows. Military personnel in the airport, both active duty and veterans, started gathering with obvious excitement. Cell phones came out as people prepared to witness what promised to be an extraordinary event. The businessman from Flight 447 was standing near the windows, still engaged in his phone conversation, when he overheard other passengers talking about the flyover. "Did you hear that announcement?" one person said. "They're doing a flyover for some colonel named Morrison." "Morrison," the businessman repeated, the name registering in his memory. "Wait, that old guy on our flight was named Morrison, wasn't he?" The woman with the designer bags had overheard the same conversations. She looked around the terminal with growing confusion, trying to spot the military personnel who were obviously gathering for something important. "That can't be the same person," she muttered to herself. "That old man couldn't possibly be anyone important." Meanwhile, the college students who had made jokes during the flight were also beginning to piece things together. One of them pulled out his phone and began searching for Colonel Morrison online. What he found made his face go pale. "Guys," he whispered to his friends, "I think we made a really big mistake on that flight." Back near the center of the terminal, Colonel Morrison stood with the two young pilots as more military personnel began gathering around them. Word had spread quickly through the airport's military and veteran community that a living legend was present. Airport security had to establish a respectful perimeter to manage the growing crowd of people who wanted to meet him or simply be present for the tribute. "Sir," Captain Rodriguez said, checking his watch, "they should be coming into view right about now." The first sign was not visual, but auditory. The distinctive sound of jet engines approaching at high speed began to echo through the terminal. Conversations stopped as people strained to hear the approaching aircraft. Even those who weren't particularly interested in military aviation could sense that something significant was about to happen. Then they appeared. 6 F-35 Lightning II aircraft came into view from the south, flying in perfect formation at an altitude low enough to be clearly visible from the terminal windows. The sleek, angular silhouettes of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world cut through the afternoon sky with precision and grace that took everyone's breath away. The formation was flying in what military aviators call the missing man formation. 5 aircraft in a tight diamond pattern, with one aircraft flying slightly behind and above the others. As they approached the airport, the trailing aircraft suddenly pulled up and away from the formation, climbing sharply into the sky. This maneuver, traditionally used to honor fallen comrades, was being performed to honor Colonel Morrison's legendary service. The remaining 5 aircraft continued their approach, and as they passed directly over the terminal building, something unprecedented happened. Each pilot, flying at 250 miles per hour and maintaining perfect formation, managed to rock their aircraft slightly from side to side, the aviation equivalent of a salute. The sight was breathtaking. These were not old aircraft performing a routine flyover. These were the most sophisticated fighter jets ever built, each costing over $80 million, flown by the elite pilots of the United States Air Force. And they were saluting a single man who was standing quietly in an airport terminal. The sound was overwhelming as the aircraft passed overhead. The powerful engines of 6 F-35s created a thunderous roar that vibrated through the terminal building. Windows shook. Car alarms went off in the parking garage, and every person in the airport stopped what they were doing to witness this extraordinary tribute. As the aircraft disappeared into the distance, the terminal erupted in applause. Military personnel were standing at attention, many with tears in their eyes. Veterans in civilian clothes saluted toward the windows. Airport workers had stopped their duties to watch the flyover, and even the most jaded frequent travelers were moved by what they had just witnessed. Captain Rodriguez's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He answered and listened briefly before holding the phone toward Colonel Morrison. "Sir, it's our squadron commander. He wants to speak with you directly." Morrison took the phone and spoke quietly for a few moments before handing it back. His eyes were slightly moist, and it was clear that even this experienced military leader had been moved by the tribute. "What did he say, sir?" Lieutenant Chen asked. "He said that every pilot in that formation volunteered to participate when they heard I was here. They broke off from a training mission to perform that flyover." Morrison paused, visibly emotional. He also said that the call sign, Hawk, is still used as the example of excellence in their pilot training manuals. The crowd around Morrison had grown significantly during the flyover. Military personnel from various branches of service had gathered to pay their respects. Airport employees had asked their supervisors if they could take a few minutes to meet the colonel. Even civilians who had witnessed the extraordinary tribute wanted to express their gratitude for his service. But the most dramatic reactions were coming from the passengers who had tormented Morrison during the flight. The businessman had managed to piece together the truth through conversations he overheard and quick internet searches on his phone. The old man he had mocked and insulted was Colonel William Morrison, one of the most decorated combat pilots in Air Force history. The flyover by the F-35s, aircraft that represented the pinnacle of American military technology, had been performed specifically to honor the man he had dismissed as a confused elderly passenger. The reality hit him like a physical blow. He had spent 3 hours insulting a war hero, a man who had risked his life countless times defending the country, a living legend whose tactical innovations were still being used by pilots around the world. The businessman stood frozen near the windows, his important phone calls forgotten, as he grappled with the magnitude of his mistake. The woman with the designer bags was having a similar revelation. Through social media posts and news articles that others were sharing, she learned that the confused old man she had complained about was actually Colonel Morrison. The photos she saw online showed a younger Morrison in his flight suit, standing beside F-16s and F-22s, receiving medals from generals and presidents. The contrast between her assumptions and the reality of who he was left her speechless. The college students were perhaps the most shocked of all. Their internet search had revealed not just Morrison's military record, but also stories about his character and integrity. They found interviews with pilots he had mentored, articles about his volunteer work with veteran organizations, and testimonials from families of soldiers whose lives he had saved. The man they had made cruel jokes about was widely regarded as one of the finest examples of military service and human decency. As word spread through the airport about who Colonel Morrison really was, the reactions became increasingly dramatic. Passengers who had overheard the harassment on the flight began approaching airport security to report what they had witnessed. Several people had recorded video of the F-35 flyover and were posting it on social media with explanations of why it had occurred. The story began spreading rapidly online. Within an hour of the flyover, videos and photos were being shared thousands of times across various platforms. News outlets began picking up the story, and it wasn't long before the incident became a viral sensation that would be seen by millions of people around the world. Airport security eventually approached the businessman, the woman, and the college students. Other passengers had reported their behavior during the flight, and with Morrison's identity now public knowledge, their actions were being viewed very differently. "Excuse me," a security supervisor said to the businessman. "We've received reports about incidents on Flight 447. We'd like to speak with you about your interactions with Colonel Morrison." The businessman's face went from pale to red as he realized that his behavior had been witnessed and reported by multiple people. The professional reputation he was so concerned about protecting was now in serious jeopardy, and not because of anything related to his work, but because of his cruelty toward a war hero. Similar conversations were taking place with the other passengers who had participated in the harassment. The woman found herself trying to explain her comments to airport security while other travelers looked on with obvious disgust. The college students, who had thought their behavior was just harmless fun, now understood that they had publicly humiliated themselves on a flight full of witnesses. Meanwhile, Colonel Morrison continued to meet with the military personnel and veterans who had gathered to honor him. Despite the attention and acclaim, he remained gracious and humble, spending time talking with each person who approached him. He asked about their service, their families, and their experiences, treating every interaction with the same respect he had shown throughout his career. When a young airman thanked him for his service, Morrison responded, "The thanks go to you and all the others who are serving now. You're the ones defending freedom today." A retired Navy pilot who had served during the same era as Morrison approached with tears in his eyes. "Colonel, I flew with guys who trained under you. You saved a lot of lives with the techniques you developed." Morrison shook the man's hand warmly. "We all did our part. That's what service means." As the afternoon progressed, the story continued to gain momentum on social media and news outlets. The contrast between Morrison's dignity in the face of harassment and the extraordinary tribute from the F-35 pilots resonated with people around the world. The incident became a symbol of how appearances could be deceiving and how true heroism often came in quiet, unassuming forms. The passengers who had mocked Morrison found themselves becoming infamous for all the wrong reasons. As videos of the flyover spread online, people began sharing stories about what had happened during the flight. The businessman's company received angry calls and emails. The woman's social media accounts were flooded with criticism. The college students discovered that their behavior had been recorded by other passengers and was now being viewed by thousands of people. But perhaps the most powerful moment came near the end of the day, when Colonel Morrison was finally preparing to leave the airport. As he walked slowly toward the exit, the same measured pace he had maintained throughout his ordeal, something remarkable happened. Every military person in the terminal, from active duty personnel to veterans, formed two lines, creating a corridor for him to walk through. As he passed, each person stood at attention and saluted. The sight of dozens of service members from all branches of the military paying their respects to the elderly man who had been mocked just hours earlier created a powerful image that would be remembered long after the news cycle moved on to other stories. Colonel Morrison walked through the corridor of honor with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his career. He nodded to each person who saluted him, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and the weight of responsibility he had carried for more than 4 decades of service. As he reached the exit and stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, the extraordinary day at the airport came to an end. But the impact of what had happened, the reminder that heroism often comes in unexpected forms and that everyone deserves respect regardless of their appearance, would continue to resonate far beyond that single day in Washington, D.C.